since before she came into the program. Now she's a program director at Mental Health America of Georgia, where she advocates and lobbies for mental health services around the state and spends a lot of time in the State House, from what I understand. And so she's going to talk to you today. So please join me in welcoming Yosha Dotson.
Thank you, Yosha. Thank you all for having me. Someone asked me whenever I was walking in if I was nervous. No, this kind of feels like home for me. So you're never nervous going home. I guess unless you're taking a significant other. But as Dean Cheyette said, my name is Yosha Dotson, and I graduated with my MSW in 2017. I was so incredibly macro-focused. And I kept saying, I want to do something as it relates to policy. I need to do something as it relates to policy. Because I knew that's where my passion lied, and I knew that's what I wanted to be able to do. And I was fortunate enough to end up in an organization that is called Mental Health America of Georgia. That organization is an education, outreach, and advocacy organization where we do everything from, we cover the entire lifespan, so we call it pediatrics to geriatrics, and we also cover the entire state, so 159 counties. That's a pretty large task. There are only 5 of us on full-time staff right now. And there are 4 interns that work with us. And so, as such, you can imagine that the task ahead of us is large, but I have ended up in a place where advocacy and policy are at the forefront and one of the actual pillars of the organization. To talk about advocacy a bit, we advocate for, Mental Health America of Georgia advocates for mental health. That means being able to advocate for peers. It means being able to advocate for those people who are living well, who may have had a mental health challenge in the past. It means being able to break down stigma. It means being able to talk to legislators as well as other individuals in the community about what mental health actually is. Sometimes that advocacy is opposed to the narrative that you hear in the media, right? But it doesn't stop us from doing our work. One of the most important lessons that I have learned is, as Dean Cheyette said, I actually go down to the Capitol. There are 40 days in a legislative session, and I go down probably 39 of those 40 days to talk about mental health and to educate legislators about mental health. And one of the most important lessons that I learned about advocacy, I actually learned when I was probably 10 days in to a 40-day legislative session. And there was this whole thing about football players and kneeling, and is that okay, and how is that in the state? And just a very brief story, I had gone probably on day number 7 and met with a few legislators and shook their hands and talked to them about mental health, and they smiled in my face, and they were very welcoming and opening while we stood in their office. And 3 days later, they put out a resolution that said, football is very American, and as the state of Georgia has some of the greatest football teams, and as the state of Georgia, etc., etc., we urge all Georgians to stand for the playing of the national anthem and wouldn't have it any other way. I don't know if anyone else in the room knows, but I'm a black woman. Less than 3 months before that, I had a friend who was killed by police. And so, in reading that resolution from a representative who was actually my representative, I began to feel this tightness on the inside of my chest and in my stomach. And I picked up the phone and I called the external lobbyist that we deal with, who doesn't quite look like me. He's a white man, which is kind of good to have in a Republican-run state Senate and House. And I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, "Can you believe this?" And excuse my language, but he said, "I cannot believe this shit." And I go, "They don't even understand. This isn't what it's about. The protest is about," and I go on this long rant about what the protest is really about. "And are we not in America where we can afterwards he said, I agree with everything that you just said. Then he said to me, but is it more important to be right or to be heard? He said, there are people in your population who can't speak up for themselves. What does you going to the Capitol and being right do for those individuals who can't speak for themselves? Because at the end of the day, you also have a job to do. And I said, I'm going to call you back. Slammed down the phone, tossed it on the bed. And I flounced down on the bed and began to cry uncontrollably. It was this balance between how in the world am I going to be heard? And do I have to squelch my voice and the fire that is literally within me to be able to advocate in this type of position? And it was a very tough question for me. And so I collected myself. And then I called my executive director and I was like, you saw this resolution? And she was like, yeah, I saw it. I said, these are the things that bother me about it. And she was like, yeah, I know, bother me too, you know. And I said, but our lobbyist asked me a very interesting question. Is it more important to be right or is it more important to be heard? So then I really think there's a way to do both. There's a way to do both. And I think a part of that way of doing both is being able to understand that your rightness comes from you being able to do what is important to you according to your morals and your values. But there's also, how do I present my rightness? How do I present it? And a part of that for us is by being able to find the statistics and the research that go along with what it is that I am presenting. Another part of it is being able to say what part of advocating or what part of this is important to you. So as an individual, when I go out and talk to you, I'm not talking to your Republican and I'm not talking to your Democrat. I am talking to your humanness. I am talking to the part of you that is a human just like me. I am talking to the part of you, 1 in 5 individuals has a mental illness. 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 6 children. That means every individual that I talk to in this room has either had a mental health challenge or they know someone that has. Most times, in less than 2 persons removed. I am reaching out to you to advocate for what I believe in as a part of my humanness to your humanness. Whenever we focus on only being right and we shout from the rafters, sometimes it can alienate those who don't necessarily believe the way that we do. But as social workers, when you talk about the person and the environment, it's not just my bubble. That environment extends to my school. That environment extends to my county, or my city, my county. That environment extends up to my state. And it's a beautiful thing when you can advocate from a human to a human. Since that time, I have made connections and have gotten support from individuals that you would have never thought would invite a young black woman to come in, have a seat, and let's have a conversation. Because I didn't want to be right, I wanted to be heard. The interesting thing is, when I'm heard, because I know I'm right, you're getting just what you need to be able to help make that change. So I will take that situation And there were consumers in the room. So I've gone from, again, our programs, we do education, we do outreach, and we do advocacy. So a piece of the that happened in the advocacy world. But a piece of the education and outreach that we were doing included a room of consumers who had a few providers in that space as well. Whenever I brought that situation up, one of the consumers said, hey, so do you stand or do you kneel for the national anthem? And one of the providers in the room, we as providers, we know it, right? We know it all. That's just how we are as providers. That was sarcasm. So one of the providers immediately talked over and around her question and basically looked to me to condone or to say thanks for doing that. Which I didn't necessarily agree with. Again, I'm a social worker. So when she did it, I answered the provider's question. And then I looped us right back around to what the consumer had asked. And I said to her, we're talking about advocating for yourself. That means that you become emotionally tied to whatever it is that you're advocating for, whatever services you need, etc., etc. And I said to her, whenever you're talking to someone about what services you need, is it more important for you to be right, or is it more important for you to be heard? And she looked, she goes, I need for them to hear what I need. I need for them to hear what it is that I need. And so it goes back to the same thing, right? It's the consumer that is saying, I need to be heard. At the legislative level, we need to be heard. That is what is the most important thing, is to be heard. It's interesting because sometimes to be heard, and I'll just say this, for the consumer, it was a lesson, but also for the provider, it was a lesson. You can't discount what your consumers are saying. You have to be able to listen and respond and not talk over them so that they can get an understanding of what is going on, so that they can tell you how they feel in treatment, so that they can tell you what things are working for them or not, right? You can't just glance over and gloss over what a consumer says. In all of my work over the last 2 years, going into 2 years now, there has been a certain standard that exists at the Capitol. That standard primarily does not look like me. It is changing, and it is changing rapidly. But one of the things that we have to be able to do, a lot of times that fire that is within you, that fire that says, I am right about this, we have to understand that someone on the opposing side also has that same fire in their belly. When we stop and take a moment and acknowledge each other's humanness, we are much more effective in our efforts. And that doesn't mean that you won't have phone calls where you let it rip to your friends or whomever. You're very close associates. That won't mean that whenever you pass a certain person in the halls of whatever legislative or policy body that you're in, that you won't go because you know some shenanigans are about to happen. That is not what it means. What it means is when I walk within your door to advocate for those 1 in 5, when I walk within your door to advocate for those 1 in 6 children, when I began building the partnerships that I need to make sure that mental health can move forward, because there are partnerships required. I told you there are 5 of us in our office. There are only 2 of us that even approach advocacy work and policy work. One of them is myself, and the other is the executive director, if you can imagine how much time she does not have to devote to policy. When we began to notice and talk to each other and speak to each other's commonalities, we find that there's much more ground that we can work from. We find that, oh, you had a grandson that died in in an opioid crisis? Oh wait, you had someone who's suffering from schizophrenia? Oh wait, you have someone who, and then we can begin to talk about it. You can say, what other representatives would you recommend that I talk to? This one's been talking about it, and that one's been talking about it, and this one's been talking about it, and that one's been talking about it, and you end up with a list of 10 people to contact and communicate with that you didn't have an opportunity before. Had I insisted on being right, I could have burned some of those bridges before I ever got started. So whenever you go into whatever your perspective space is, whether it be a program, whether it be a legislative body, whether it be counseling, one of the ways that we always advocate first is by listening. And after we listen, you feel the fire in your belly. Yes, there's fire here. Where's the humanness of the other individual that I am talking to? What are they saying? Why is it important to them? And then you can effectively. Any questions? That's it. Any questions?
So this is your chance to ask questions to somebody who's walking the walk.
Yeah.
So as someone in the, we're talking about differences and partisanship and everything, one thing that this makes me think of is, after several mass shootings recently, there's always a discussion of the hyper-polarized discussion of, does this have to do something to do with gun control? Does this have, and then other legislators say, oh, it's all about mental health. And part of me is like annoyed by that, disgusted. I have like this whole range of emotions about it. Then another part of me wonders if that's like an opportunity. I don't know, what is your orientation toward when policymakers do make it? They tend to pay a lot of lip service to that in those moments. Do you think that that is sincere, or is there an opportunity for it?
So this actually is one of the very first things that whenever I got to MHA, one of the very first things that we had to deal with, there was a shooting, and of course the media is going on about, oh, he had this mental illness, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I remember getting on the phone call. We have a policy call every week during session, and I remember saying to them, we really need to tackle this. We really need to, put out, and the other part of my background is in marketing and advertising. So when I see things on the media, I'm not oblivious to what's going on behind the scenes, right? Part of it is you need views, you need those types of things. But this is one of the very issues that we talked about. So I am a new advocate, right? So there are certain things that I see and I feel and I will do differently than, say, folks who our organization is about 70 years old. And I remember someone being on the call, and she's been with the organization for many, many years. And she said, we don't traditionally talk about that. We let all of that play out in the media, right? We don't get involved in the, is it a gun, is it a mental health conversation? And I said, but that doesn't make sense to me because we're a mental health organization. And very respectfully, because of course she is, she has been doing this for way longer than I have. And she goes, yeah, but that's just never been our way. And I looked, she wasn't the executive director, and I looked at my executive director and I said to her, I am afraid that if we don't say something, we will get caught kind of on our heels or, taken aback because folks are going to ask this question. If you Google mental health in Georgia, our name pops up. And so sure enough, 2 days later, we start getting a barrage of calls from media saying, hey, what is your, how do you feel? What is your debate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The balance that we have to walk with that is that we cannot determine and will not determine. We're an organization that is about mental health, but we're also an organization that is about your civil rights. And so as that type of organization, it is the right of someone to have a gun. But we also know the facts, right? So whenever we were talking about research earlier and being able to look at the research, right? no more, the facts say this. The facts say that someone with a mental illness is more likely to harm themselves than they are to harm someone else. That's what the facts say. I can say that to a reporter and not have a conversation with them at all about guns. Right? So this is how you advocate. I can say to a reporter, so just because someone is well today does not mean that their mental health may not go something that triggers a mental health crisis for them tomorrow. Mental health is all of our health. Mental health belongs to everyone. We all have it, and we're all around people that have it, right? So it's not that we don't, even within my point is this, even within our organization, you have people that believe on different sides of it. I am fully a believer that as advocates, we need to be able to put out a white paper, we need to be able to put out a position paper, any of those things. As someone who had been with the organization longer, she had the history that we don't typically do that. After this barrage of calls happened though, right? She looked at me and said, maybe we do need to do something about this whole gun conversation. Okay. Again, I didn't have to attack her. Why do we not talk about guns, right? No, we could potentially get a barrage of calls. And when that barrage of calls started coming in, she saw from that conversation that this is something that we should shift and have some conversation around. The same thing goes whenever you talk about, so my point is advocacy can happen within your own organizations as well. The same conversation we had to have as elections were coming up, and this is about understanding cycles and understanding the policy around it, right? Or understanding the practices around the legislature, right? As elections were coming up and this shooting happened, there were several policymakers or lawmakers who actually began to draft legislation and try to, Georgia does have a law that says that if someone is involuntarily committed, that they, for 5 years, have to be on the FBI, the federal FBI's list, and cannot purchase a firearm. If within that 5 years, they have not been, re-involuntarily committed, or they haven't had their rights stripped by a judge, right? So they haven't been deemed incompetent and had their rights stripped by a judge, then they can be taken off of that removal list. So we had policymakers going, we need to do what the rest of the country does, and it's not really the rest of the country. There are, I want to say 6 or 7 states that actually have similar policies to ours. Some of the other states don't turn in any information to the FBI at all. It's all over the place. But they were saying what we need to do is just go ahead and leave those persons on. Go ahead and leave those persons on the registry, the FBI registry, indefinitely. Our problem with that being a civil rights organization is what you're basically saying is if someone has a mental health crisis where they're involuntarily committed at age 21, age 23, when they turn 45, they still don't have a right to own a firearm, regardless of what their mental health has been for the last 20 however many years, right? And so it's one of those things of we recognized it for what it was. Number one, knowing the system, right? So it was proposed by a Democrat. The Democrats don't have the House, they don't have the Senate. Is it really likely to go anywhere? Democrats, Republicans in the state of, and I think I said Democrats, Republicans have the House and the Senate here in Georgia. Is it likely to go anywhere because it was proposed by a Democrat? Is it likely that Republicans would vote, right, to ban guns for people? Not highly likely. However, we still took the opportunity to go to that, the sponsor of that bill, that change on that bill, to say, hey, can you tell us, and this goes back to the fire in my belly, right, versus what you're saying to me across the table. Can you tell us what your intentions are with that bill. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you're proposing it? What you find out a lot of times from these legislators is that they're actually doing things based on what their constituents are saying and asking of them. For instance, their constituent might be saying, hey, I had a nephew who was in this area or that area that was a victim of. And so the constituents might be leaning on the legislator. And a lot of times they want to implement something for 159 counties that might be true for one city. So whenever we can get to that, right, if we can get to it and say, hey, oh, is that what you're trying to do? In this county, this is happening. In this county, this is happening. In this county, this is happening, right? Give those scenarios. How about if we move legislation in this direction? I think it would help all five. Does that make sense? It was a long answer to your question, but yeah, sometimes it is them trying to capitalize on the moment, but we also have to be ready to step up and capitalize on the moment as well. Yes, ma'am.
I'd love to hear some of your favorite parts about your job and some of the toughest parts.
I'll do toughest first. Definitely the toughest part is being down in an environment where you know that most people might not think like you know that most people might not understand where you come from all of the time. You hear them a lot of times talk about a good old boys club, and it definitely exists. Dealing with that is not necessarily my favorite part of the job. However, when I can walk into a space and have one of those good old boys say, oh, Yosha, hey, come on over, let's talk, right? That to me says, okay, Yosha, you're making headway, you're getting through. Or to have some of them say, hey, tell me what I should know about XYZ. You know I had that type of situation where I went to talk to one of the legislators, and he was on the Senate School Safety Committee. In school safety, they talk a lot about mental health. And so whenever I sat down and had a conversation with him, he immediately said, you need to present at this school safety committee meeting. And I said, okay. I said, I do recall reaching out to this particular senator. I said, I believe he's over it, and I wasn't able to get an appointment. And he looked at his assistant and he said, take her down to their office right now and get her on the schedule. So those are some of the favorite parts, when you find out that you're making some real headway. Questions? Yes, sir.
I guess I've been trying to find a way to formulate this question since I sat down. But how do you, I guess, find the balance when you're meeting with these individuals? How do you find the balance for trying to convey what you feel is right, while still having that I want to be heard approach, so that you don't come out as that opposite?
One of the tricks I use quite often is just what I talked about, is asking a question. Whenever I go in and sit down, I never just start talking to them right away about my issue, right? And it's a little bit different if you're standing on the ropes, right, at the Capitol. You only have a few minutes because they have to come and go very quickly because a lot of times they're taking votes and they can only miss so many votes, right? But I think a part of that also goes to our knowledge about the system. If you don't understand that a legislator, if you're down at the Capitol and you're standing in line and there's this bell that you're hearing, ding, 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 that means that they're actively voting and they can only miss so many votes. So when they come out, they're coming out to talk to you as their constituent. But the other piece of that is they also have a duty to make sure that they don't miss a certain number of votes over the legislative session. So and this is what I meant when I said humanness, right? So instead of saying, oh, he was so rude, he only spent a couple of minutes with me, it is, oh, he took the time to come out and talk to me and have a couple of words with me and hear about my issue. In that type of situation, I'm going to hit the highlights. But there's also certain stuff that you need to do, like following up with your legislator to thank them afterwards and ask them if you can have a conversation with them, a more in-depth conversation with them about whatever your issue is. So your question, again, if you are bringing the issue to them, you already have that fire inside of you that's saying this is something that is right to do. I think they understand that. A lot of times people are surprised when their legislators give them their cell phone numbers, and when they call it, the legislator answers. A lot of people are surprised by that. They actually answer their phones when they give you the number. If you take the time to sit down and talk to them, they want to hear from you, especially if you're their constituent. So a part of that is bridging that gap, right? What have they done? And this is what I'm saying. I never sit down in an office and immediately start talking about legislation. When I sit down in an office, oh, I see you have pictures of your kids here. Oh, went to UGA, I did too. What year? When did they graduate? What was their major? And those types of things do that, give that connection of humanness. This is not just about black and white on legal paper. I am an individual, I am a human being. Most legislators actually get into it because they want to be able to help their constituents. That's good to know. There's some that don't, but most of them do. Most of them actually have other jobs. So they're taking their time to do it, but they want to be able to make things better. Does that help?
Yes.
I hope that, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a quick comment and a question. The way you just described it is kind of similar to if you were a clinical social worker and you're developing rapport with a client. So in some ways it's no different. But you said it when you first started that you were macro all the way. But now that you're doing policy advocacy, do you have a connection with clinical social workers to kind of help inform your message? Or what is that relationship between advocates? And I'm not assuming that advocates have to be macro, but kind of macro advocates and then clinical social workers.
Sure. So our organization always talks about advocacy from 3 different points. We talk about the self-advocate, so a consumer, someone who might be a client advocating for themselves. We talk about individual advocacy, which is someone who advocates on behalf of another or on behalf of another group. And then we talk about the systemic advocacy as well. To Dr. Ballard's point, one of the things that we have to do, again, there are only 5 of us, and it's funny because whenever you go down, being down at the Capitol, we see so many different faces, and you begin to know the other lobbyists, you begin to know the other advocates. But one of the things we do is we're a part of probably 7 or 8 different coalitions. Those coalitions come along with all different types of career paths, right? So we're on a coalition with folks who are in law enforcement. We're on a coalition with folks who are social workers. We're on a coalition with people who do youth education. And a part of that is being able to tap into that collective knowledge to be able to align our voices so that whenever we go down to the Capitol, we're all giving the same message. You know, we believe that Medicaid expansion could be a good thing. So we lobby and advocate with folks who are for the Georgians for a Healthy Future, who their sole purpose is being able to expand Medicaid in the state. They have a very tough fight, and we've stopped using the words Medicaid expansion in the same sentence, but there are other ways to be able to talk about it. But to your point, that type of collaboration and that type of coalition is definitely important. And a part of what I've been doing in the off session has been going to different organizations and different associations and saying, here's what our policy agenda is, and they'll reach across the table and I'll take theirs, and we go, we have this, and this in common. Let's talk about it. Let's do it. How do we move forward? Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Just to keep the positive message going, I want to make sure that you all know that the new state representative for Gwinnett County is Shelley Hutchinson, who is an alumna of the program. So we have a social worker in the general, a master's level social worker in the General Assembly now. Wow. And she's also part of the faculty for us. So if you ever bring her next, she might be teaching you.
And she also beat the incumbent for that district.
She's lovely, and is the head of the Social Empowerment Center. Some of you might have been placements there. She's the person who founded it. She's a developer. She rocks, basically. And she's been represented in that. So, all right. Other last thing I would task you with is, God, please take those cookies with you. Take them to classes or something, because we do not need carbohydrates laying around here. And thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Yosha. Really.
I have to help. Kind of like all of this social worker contribute to society.